We need to talk about contextualizing the stance now. We need to know that can we understand a stance without its context, or a context is primary to the understanding of any stance? Let's try to figure out this in the following slides. If a stance is an utterance, or if a stance is an act, we need to understand in its real life utterance. We cannot understand it in isolated sentences or isolated pieces of language which are displaced from its actual location. Just for the sake of argument, let's assume for a moment that isolated pieces of language, which we usually call grammatical units or sentences, may convey the meanings or the stances also. Just assume. I'm not concluding it. I'm just assuming that if we just say for a moment that sentences can also convey meaning, let's say how far they are able to convey that. The sentences can be hypothesized as an abstract linguistic structure detached from any mooring in a specific context of use. Sentences are written in grammar books. They are seen as a unit of grammar, and they are not seen as some kind of utterance which is there in actual use of language. So if we take sentences as something which is isolated from the actual location of their utterance, how far they can convey a stance. Just consider the following sentences. The Caribbean is incredible. It was really great. I would love to go. Each of these statements or sentences conveys some evaluative sense. For example, incredible, great, and love, and maybe other words can be evaluative also, but these words are clearly evaluative. But do you think we can understand the evaluation embedded in here without knowing the context? For example, it was really great. What was great? What was being talked about? Unless you know other things in the context, you won't be able to interpret it. Similarly, if you see the Caribbean is incredible, what is so lovely about Caribbean which makes it incredible? You need to know it, and you would probably would look into the context in which that utterance was made in order to know why somebody or a certain interlocutor is calling Caribbean is incredible. There could be more than one reasons for Caribbean to be incredible, or there may be something in the mind of the speaker also. So in order to know all these things, the real stance behind the statements, we need to know the situation. Otherwise, we would not be able to understand what kind of stance has been made. Therefore, we can say, but stance is more than the context-free connotation of words or sentences. So what I want to convey is, if you want to know a certain stance or point of view of an interlocutor, you would have to understand more than mere meaning of the words. You have to consider that words are not mere grammatical units, rather they are something which happens in the real world, in real utterances, and we need to know that real world or real world situations in which those occur. Pragmatically speaking, we call such situations, or broadly speaking, we call them the context of those utterances. In the grammarian standard presentation of the isolated sentences, stance always remains incomplete. We cannot, as I've already mentioned, we cannot reach to the core of the real stance or opinion which is being generated. The missing ingredients can only be found by contextualizing the utterance. Any utterance carries cues for its own indexical contextualization. We could reach to the context of any utterance by looking the clues which are embedded in that very utterance. Contextualization cues or indexical signs work by pointing beyond the utterance to its presupposed conditions of use. In what situation those words were uttered, that's very important to be understood. Then, and they are necessary to reach a successful interpretation or understanding of a stance. In this regard, we can point out few things which are important to understand a stance in a certain context. What do you need to know about a context of a stance? First of all, you need to know who is the stance taker, who is saying it, and that would clarify a lot of things. Then you need to know what is the object of stance, what was the point of discussion, what was said before, uh, what is being interpreted, the stance being interpreted, and what was said after it. What was the actual uh, point or topic of discussion? That would help you in figuring out so many things about the stance. And then, what stance is the stance taker responding to? Is stance taker responding to a certain point of view which has already been shared, or stance which has already been made? Then it would further clarify you that what kind of stance has been taken. So each question points to one component of the process of interpreting stance. By getting answers to these questions and maybe some more questions, you would be able to interpret a stance in a context. So in order to conclude this point, we might say that we can understand a stance only in its context. And if we just look at a stance in fragmented or isolated pieces of words or sentences, we probably would not be able to reach to the core of a stance. We might, there is every likelihood that we might misunderstand a stance. Therefore, as it has been at the heart of critical discourse analysis also, we need to understand the context of a stance in order to understand it properly.